It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's the Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That is Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. I am coming to you from the same chair that I always sit in. Logan coming to us from a hotel somewhere in California. Not to be confused, Logan, with Hotel California. That's a very popular song from a long time ago.
Great song. That's one of my favorite songs of all time. Yeah, so I'm out in California, Los Gatos, doing some combine stuff, and it's early out here, Craig. It's very, very early out here, so I'm got a little sleep in my eyes still. You're probably bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at this point.
Yeah, we got a long day ahead. Our couch that was supposed to be delivered last Thursday is finally getting delivered today. So we gotta move another couch out. We gotta move some stuff around. But excited to finally have our home come together. The weather here in DC, not kind to deliveries last week. Anyway, nobody cares about that. Here's what they care about. We got football stuff to talk about. The Commanders' head coaching search is ongoing. We will touch on that kind of through the lens of the playoff games like we did last week on the show. And then we will, towards the end of the show, get into what Logan is doing out in California. You mentioned some combine stuff, kind of what the process looks like for prospects at this point, what you're doing helping some of these prospects, and then some other thoughts as you started to watch some film of some of the players that the Commanders might be looking at too. So we'll get into all of that as we go, Logan, but let's just go in order of the playoff games on the divisional round, and we can talk about obviously some of the coaches and kind of this, the tangent topics off of that as it relates to the Commanders. Starting with the Ravens' big win over the Texans, 34-10. In Commanders terminology, if you will, it's Bobby Slowick versus Mike Macdonald. That's what a lot of people care about. But I'm curious, how you would kind of respond to this idea that because Macdonald has now beaten Slowick twice this season, or their teams have, that it's like, oh, well, why would you ever consider Bobby Slowick? Like, clearly Mike Macdonald's better. Can you talk about the differences and like what role playoff performances by a coordinator play in their resume as a future head coach?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's something that people maybe don't fully understand. Like, obviously, it's an important data point, and it's something that is relevant to your coaching search because you want guys that win football games. But ultimately, like, I think fans and people that aren't familiar with the process really undervalue the interview process.
Yes.
Like, the resume is important, obviously, and you winning football games is important. But what do you like in the room? Like when Kyle and Sean were both interviewing for jobs, there was this like prevailing thought that Sean was going to be more impressive in the interview because he interviewed better. And like there was opportunities for Sean that weren't there for Kyle because Kyle, has changed in this regard, but was a little bit standoffish, a little bit abrasive at that point in his career. And, obviously has grown out of that and become this guy that is a brilliant head coach. But I think there's so much to be said for how you deal with the people in that room that are on that team of the selection committee, right? How you talk to Josh Harris, how you talk to Adam Gates, all these different guys, right? Like what does that look like? What is your vision? How do you present that? Because really, like everyone gives Ron a hard time for saying that he's been managing for the last 3 years, but the head coach is a leader, a manager, unless you're calling plays. Obviously, that's a little bit different, but it's really about your relationship with those people and how you present yourself in those meetings. So while that is an important data point, like it doesn't really matter. Like once you get in that room, that's the thing that's going to really decide. Like think about Sean's record, but when he went out to LA, like the year prior when they were coached, it wasn't great. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, here's this guy that's been super successful, super dynamic. It's like you were hiring a guy who was a charismatic leader, who had a vision for an offense, who had a vision for a team, and he had a good interpersonal relationships that were very high, or that skill was very high for him. So I look at that and I think like that's why you're doing these interviews, right? Is to get that stuff. It's not the football stuff. These guys are all smart football coaches. Like all the guys we've talked about on this show, all the guys they've interviewed are very, very smart football minds. It's about the interpersonal relationships and your vision for the team that can only be kind of seen when you're in that interview process.
No, I'm so glad you said that. I talked about this on the radio show on Monday, and I used Sean exactly as an example. His last game in 2016, to take it to like the head-to-head Slowick versus Macdonald thing, right? Yeah. His last game as offensive coordinator of the Commanders in 2016 was against Steve Spagnuolo and the Giants. Spags being the defensive coordinator, right? Like, Spags is an incredible defensive coordinator. He's gone on, obviously, since 2019 to win a couple Super Bowls in Kansas City. He was a part of the Giants Super Bowl winning teams back in the late aughts, early 2010s. Like, he is fantastic at that job. But if you come out of that absolute flop of a game at the end of 2016 where the Commanders have a chance to get into the playoffs and they come up short and their offense looks terrible, it's one of the worst games Kirk ever played in Washington. Like, if you just judge it off of that head-to-head matchup, you'd be like, oh, why doesn't Spags have the job?
Right.
Why doesn't, like, that's just not how this works. It's about a different skill set. Now, I do think that a clear vision for football is really important as a head coach. And that is essential to kind of partnering with Peters and building the team, right?
Right.
Like, if you can't communicate your vision of what you want your team to be, you're not going to hire a good staff because you're going to hire a bunch of maybe talented people, but that don't fit together. Like kind of what happened to Frank Reich last year in Carolina. You had all these very good coaches, all of whom are going to go get maybe even in some cases better jobs somewhere else, but didn't work well together because they didn't see the games in similar ways. If you don't have that and you can't lead that way, that's going to be a problem. But it's not necessarily about how good you are as a coordinator with another person over you as head coach. You know, the last point I'll make on this to touch on like what Ron said about the managing versus coaching thing is like Ron may have correctly identified his split between managing and coaching, but like that belies the fact the way he presented it as like, hey man, like that is the job, is to manage. You didn't do a very good job of it. And obviously that is seen in the results. So I say that just to point that out, not necessarily to pile on, but managing is the job often of a coach. The higher up you are on the ladder, the more managing you're going to have to do. And so Mike McDonald crushing Bobby Slowick for a second time this year with his very, 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 very good Ravens defense doesn't necessarily mean that like, oh, he's got a vault to the top of the head coaching list. That said, what he's doing is insanely impressive.
Yeah, what he's doing is insanely impressive. Again, like that's a very, very talented group, top to bottom. Like defensive backs, they're playing really well. Linebackers are playing well. Defensive line is playing out of this world. Just the depth they have there and the rotational ability, like the fact they're able to get so much out of a Kyle Van Noy, a guy that was on the couch, you know, for the first half of the season, comes out and looks awesome. You know, Jadeveon Clowney having the most productive year of his career. And again, like the talent's important, but, you know, seeing what he's doing, McDonald's doing from a blitz standpoint, and it really, to me, just shows you how important, like all these games, you know, like we're going to talk in generalities because there's not enough time to talk specifically about each single one. But when you can find ways to generate pressure with scheme in the NFL, you're winning football games. And I think that's what Baltimore does such a good job of. It's like, yes, you have 4 guys, probably 6 or 7 guys there that can win 1-1 pass rush, but I'm not going to ask you every single down to do that because I know that's really hard. I know that's like an unrealistic expectation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find ways to kind of create overloads, have fire zones, mess with protection rules, create free runners that will later on free you up in those obvious 4-man situations. And I think like when you look at the Baltimore game, that's the thing that separates the defensive performances. Because I do think that DeMeco Ryans called a pretty good game. I'm like, man, I like this call here. I like this pressure. I like this coverage. But the Baltimore offensive line, they just seemed a little bit more prepared in terms of how they were going to handle some of those looks. And then the other thing that just is so glaring in this game and all the games in the playoffs is that quarterback needs to be a playmaking entity for you. Like it has to happen. And I think we're going to talk about the quarterbacks here in a little bit for the draft. And I hate to be a guy of the moment, but every year in the playoffs, there's a reason like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson are guys that you're just like, you're sweating bullets when you have to play. Because like there's a simple play where DeMeco does a great job bringing nickel pressure. There's 2 free runners to the quarterback. Lamar kind of feathers back, buys a little bit of time, uses that athleticism, completes the ball for a first down. You're like, that is backbreaking for a defense because that's the right call. That's the right execution. And the quarterback just says, you know what? I'm better than you on this play. And so good luck. And I think that's the difference, obviously, is a talented roster with a good dynamic quarterback and a defensive play caller that understood how to break protections and create pressure with an experienced defensive group, to me, is kind of the thing that defines that game.
Yeah, for sure. And I think on the other side of it, right, like obviously Stroud's a playmaker as well, and there's some moments in that game where he extends drives, and that's great. But generally speaking, the offense of the Texans felt the pressure. Like McDonald and Anthony Weaver and that staff dialed up tighten the screws so much on Houston that not only did they score 3 points, but all the penalties, like the offsides, like they were jumpy the entire game. And to have an offense that, by the way, put up 45 on the Browns the week before, to have them be that out of sorts, that out of whack, that unconfident, that they're jumping off sides, once a series. That they've got all these penalties, they just can't execute the basics because they're so tight. Is really impressive. And again, like I feel like sometimes we feel like we're just downplaying McDonald because of how talented they are, and kind of making the point that they're different jobs. But I just can't speak highly enough of kind of what they're doing. And like you said, like, is there talent? Yes. But some of that talent is, guys that's primed with 5 years ago, and he's found the fountain of youth for them and found ways to set them up for success.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like he's not, like, again, like this is a game where I was really impressed with their blitz vision, and how they executed their coverages. Like, they just did such a good job of, like, in key moment. And it's not only the blitz, because not everyone runs them, but a lot of teams run these blitzes, right? The blitz is where you're bringing 4 to a side and you're dropping a guy out. To me, I just see the timing of it is so high level, right? And it's just
they're such good teachers in Baltimore.
Yes, and like the timing of it, the execution, like how the defensive end hooks the tackles inside arm, so there's no way they can bump through. How long the defensive tackles wait when they're the guys dropping out in the zones, and how quickly they get to spots, and how they know how to match. Because so many times, man, people use defensive linemen to drop, and you're relying on the defensive line coach to coach those drops, and you just get 2 guys who are dropping to nothing, right? They're not good at matching concepts. And you see these guys, you see Pierce, their nose guard, who's 375, matching number 3 with his eyes, running that direction. Like, I know what to do in these situations. So I don't want to detract from him in any way. Like, they're a very talented team, but you see it in the details, man. You see it in the timing, you see it in the understanding. Again, to get your nose guard to say, I have to match number 3 in this look, and to create a cloudy throwing window is big time stuff. In addition to having all these unique dynamic playmakers in the back end, Roquan Smith, Patrick Queen. I look at Hamilton, right? Kyle Hamilton,
Kyle
and like
Hamilton,
how they use him. It's just they're doing some, again, it's basic stuff done at a high level, and then there's some innovative stuff that you see, like with Wink Martindale, like we talked about in the last podcast, where you're like,
right,
man, that's a really good blitz. But again, other teams do it. It's just their execution, given the talent, given the coaching, is just at a high level.
Yeah. So the teaching thing, I wanted to follow up on that from your career. And like, to me, that's a trait that could translate really well to a head coach. Because it shows like a clarity of vision and an ability. Like, I look at a guy like Mike McDonald, and I don't know that he's the one teaching all this stuff. Maybe he's got great position coaches. Maybe it's both. Clearly, Anthony Weaver is very highly thought of. He's also getting head coaching looks as the D-line coach, right? But when you look at just how solid they are on all 3 levels, you have to think McDonald's a big part of teaching not just some of the bigger concepts, but some of the techniques and how to execute them, and really getting that vision so everybody understands what you're trying to accomplish as a group, not just what the individual jobs are. And to me, that would translate really well, not just to a defense that he could be coordinating as he's the head coach, but it's like, if you have an offensive player who is struggling to get something, to have someone with that clear of a global understanding of football, like, to me, that would translate well as a head coach. Is that me putting together dots that don't connect, or is that something that you've seen true in your career?
Well, I just think about the best teachers that I had as position coaches, and I think about Kyle and how good of a teacher he was. And so obviously I'm biased towards that. I think Sean was one of the best teachers I had as a tight end coach. As a coordinator, he was a great teacher. Kyle was a great teacher, as a coordinator, like in terms of his understanding of defense and how to kind of maximize you. And I think that's what you're seeing from a defensive perspective. It's one of the things we've always said about Wink Martindale and why he would potentially be a good head coach, is because he understands defensively or offensively what you're trying to do to him. And I am coaching you up. Obviously, it's clear just in the details of it, of how to beat what the offense is presenting. And I think that's where you say those skill sets, those visions are in my experience what good coaches do. You know what I mean? And I think, like, there's a reason, like Kyle Shanahan, for example, his tree is so prolific, or Mike Shanahan and that tree is so prolific, is because he's got a bunch of guys who are good teachers, good communicators, and they understand the opposition. They understand football at a high level, right? They understand offensively how to beat defenses because these are the defensive rules. And I think you're seeing a little bit of that with Mike McDonald, where you're seeing these are the defensive principles we're trying to teach, and this is how we're going to teach them to beat offensive football right now. And I think that's like, there's a reason that like when, in a heavy play action offense, you're bringing these edge pressures, like you're kind of challenging the backs and the tight ends in ways that make it very hard to execute these protections, which lead to explosive plays. And I like that. We talked about in the San Francisco game that we watched how we're going to take away Christian McCaffrey. We're going to make sure that he's not a factor in this game. And that's just good process. And I think like it kind of goes hand in hand. I'm a good teacher. I understand football. I understand the direction the game is going. I understand what you're trying to do to us. And then I can communicate it to the guys, because obviously the execution, they do have good players, obviously, but the execution's at a very high level.
Right. So that leads to the last thing before we talk about Kyle's team itself, 49ers, Packers, and then obviously we'll hit the other two games as well, but wrap up the Saturday games here in a second. But like, it is worth pointing out for McDonald, on like the resume side of it, he's the only guy that seems to be able to shut down the Shanahan tree. Yeah. Like, as he's in the coordinator position of the team that has smacked San Francisco, smacked Houston twice, smacked everybody else, Detroit, like all of them. They've crushed them. What is it that he's doing to this style of offense that is killing everyone else, that is not working against Baltimore?
So I think it's multifactorial, obviously, but one of the things that sticks out to me from a team building standpoint, because that's what we're going to be talking about here with the GM and the head coach, is when you look at Baltimore, they are a very big, very physical football team. And I don't think that's an accident. Like one of the things with outside zone, for example, and like, so think about it, like in Kyle's system, in Mike's system, whoever, it's outside zone sets up play action pass. And outside zone, the whole principle is we're going to try and get you to run horizontally to create horizontal lanes for the running back to hit. And then when we hit the play action pass, you have to move horizontally with us, vacating zones in the defense so we can hit the throw. And I think one of the things that I've seen, and one of the things that I thought that Ron was going to try and do here with the defensive line personnel that they had, is just get really big up front and be really physical and set nice physical edges. So then if I set physical edges, I can't stretch the defense. There's nowhere for the ball to go because I've got Jadeveon Clowney smashing through the tight end's face, and the back has to cut it up before he wants to.
Super fun when you're the tight end, huh?
Yeah, it's super fun. I remember one time, like this is Jadeveon Clowney's rookie year. We had outside zone. You got to get your hat across his hat. And I remember hitting him like pretty much screw to screw. And this is probably not the healthiest thing in the world, but feeling like an electric jolt from the top of my head down to my feet. And I just was like, that's not great, and like that's how he's setting edges, to kind of speak to that, right?
A violent edge, as they say. And
you need to have guys who can block those edges, but you also need to have guys who set them. And when you look at how they're built, they're big inside, they're big on the edges. From a team building standpoint, obviously there's more technical things going on here in terms of how they coach stuff up, the fronts they play, the allocate. Like we talked about this last show, like they get into different spacings. And one of the things about Kyle that's so brilliant is he's like, if you're going to get in this spacing 60% of the time, we're going to crush it. We're going to beat it because we know how to create angles to this. And they do a little bit of variety there. So you're not always in the same front spacing, which I think is great. But I just think there's something to, we are a big physical football team. You look at their offensive line, they're all like 330 plus. They're just massive, physical, athletic guys that have developed in that system. And I don't think it's an accident. Like they're always like, they drafted Ben Cleveland. He's 6'6", he's 360. They drafted Daniel Faalele. He's 6'9", 415. Like they get these guys that are just big, huge, physical dudes, and they create a culture of physicality for those guys. And I think that's part of it. It's sometimes like, we're drawing up X's and O's on the board. And when I'm playing Baltimore, I'm like, man, I don't know if our tight end can make this block. Man, I don't know if our guard can make this block because this 3 technique is going to blow him up because he's 340 and our guard's 290. Again, it's more complicated than that because there's schematic stuff which we get into and the confidence which they play. But there's something to that. There's something to having a 6'4", 225-pound nickel player that can play the post, that can play a box and cover your running back. Like there's something to that mentality. And so I think like when you're building a team, like they have a very clear identity. They have a very clear vision of who they want to be and how they want to play. And again, I think that's part of the reason why when you play Miami, Like Miami's not a big group up front. You're going to get after them. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Tell you what, instead of going to the other Saturday game, 49ers-Packers, let's hit Chiefs-Bills real quick and just do the AFC, and that way we can talk a little bit about the matchup with Kansas City and Baltimore coming up on Sunday. But this game, tremendous football game, as is always. Like, this game followed the script that all the others have. It's a tremendous football game that ends with Kansas City winning. And I cannot believe it's another wide right for Buffalo. I just feel so awful for them and their fans. Like, literally let them lose in any other heartbreaking fashion. Let the kick go wide left. Just literally don't let the kick go wide right. But also, obviously some decisions by Josh Allen late. I think one where he goes for the end zone that you're like, well, he's wide open. He just misses the guy. And some others where you're like, let's just check it down, get a little bit shorter of a kick. But generally speaking, I mean, I think what's so impressive about Kansas City is they find a run game in the playoffs. And while, yes, they are pass happy and outside of Washington, they were the pass happiest team in the league. Mahomes had more attempts than anybody but Howell. And I think it wound up being one attempt different by the end of the year. When it comes time to it, and defenses are like, nope, we're not giving up that to Patrick Mahomes, they always seem to be able to find a way. And Isaiah Pacheco was the way in this one.
Yeah, he was the way. Again, a nice physical game by him, just such a physical running style. And both teams found ways to run the football, which are traditionally like passing teams. You're running Josh Allen a little bit more, right? Cook is doing a great job carrying the football and creating plays for you. They've got depth at the running back spot, the offensive line for them, which was kind of much maligned, the Bills at the beginning of the season. They kind of find their form, and like those big athletic dudes up front are making plays for you, which is great to see. But I do think it just shows you, like, as much as you want to throw the football, you got to be able to run the ball. And this is something that maybe comes back to my biases of when I was watching the game. But when I look at Indianapolis, when I look at New England, there's a reason that New England came out victorious in a lot of those matchups, even though I think Peyton Manning was kind of more consistently a better quarterback, is because when they had to change gears, when they had to change their identity, they could run the football at a high level. I'm talking about New England. And I think it's cool to see Kansas City adopt that and not have to lean on Patrick Mahomes. And I thought it was great to see from the Bills as well. And then kind of package that all in, these two, I'm going to say, dynamic rushing attacks, because they did some really impressive stuff, and the running backs were great, with quarterbacks that just, I mean, every third down, they're elevating the offense. Every third down, they got to make a play. In the red zone, they're making plays. Like some of those throws, some of the ability, and it just, again, it goes back to the Lamar Jackson thing. But when you have that guy, and we were really fortunate and blessed to watch this game, because I think those are two top five guys, probably one and maybe three or four, depending on how you want to allocate your quarterbacks, and Josh Allen. But when he's playing good football, he's probably he's probably two, like when he's playing high level football, and that's what he looked like. And it just shows you, like, when you have a guy who can just absolutely deal, you don't have to make a perfect play call, and I think that that's something that when we're talking about the Commanders, like the importance of that second pick overall, just when I'm watching the game, I can't stop thinking about it. I'm like, you need a coordinator that understands the importance of running the football, but you got to have a guy back there who can make and extend plays. And the arm talent of Josh Allen, the kind of the moxie, the off schedule ability of Patrick Mahomes was just incredible. And again, it wasn't them all the time, but when you call on them, that they're going to make a play for you. And it was great to see other aspects of both offenses step up. And the other thing I wanted to bring up too is credit to Buffalo in terms of team building. I'm when I watch these games, I'm only thinking team building because, like, I'm draft, almost 24/7 at this point, or off season and, free agency too. But, they draft Dalton Kincaid in the first rounds. Everyone like, well, how are you going to use the tight end? And they have this vision for how they're going to use kind of this, big zebra, big 11 personnel, and get him involved and have him making plays. And I just think it just shows you how having the coach, the coordinator, the GM all on the same page leads to very productive decisions from a personnel standpoint.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's kind of, the Bills are at this crossroads where they're kind of where New England was after their first group of championships. Unfortunately for Buffalo, they haven't won any. Right. But like, New England was like, oh crap, we got to reinvent what we're doing offensively. And they went to this 2 tight end thing. It obviously was upended in the worst possible way, as in one of them turned out to be a murderer. Right. But, from a football planning standpoint, it was a good idea. Aaron Hernandez and Gronk. and they reinvented their offense, and Brady was exceptional. They wound up doing it again, and let's see, with Randy Moss, and like that was in a different order, but you get the point. Like they found different ways throughout the back half of Brady's career to make sure that he had what he needed in a bunch of different styles to ultimately be successful against the NFL defense of the day. And for Allen now, like they've got to figure out, okay, how do we keep this thing going? Like the Stephon Diggs era is probably over. So what do we do now to make sure that he's got what he needs? And the Kincaid-Knox duo seems like it's going to be at the center of that. And then Kansas City is going to kind of enter the same thing here as Kelsey is ending or nearing the end of his career. Still obviously got it, 2 touchdowns on Sunday, but like as Rashee Rice emerges, like what does that look like in kind of the next phase? Do they lean heavier into a running attack, knowing that running backs are easily findable in the draft, and just kind of make sure the O-line's set? Like I think it's been pretty fascinating to watch the team building of these two teams as well, with that quarterback in place and highly paid. Because that's the other thing too, is like Mahomes' numbers already been kind of big. That's why they had to trade Tyreek a couple years ago. Yeah. But Josh Allen's number balloons this year. Like he's finally off of the rookie stuff. He's off of the early years of the contract. Like next year is the first big Josh Allen year, and how the Bills build it up now, and especially since they haven't won anything with him, not his fault, but is going to be pretty fascinating. And we talk about team building. I don't know that it gets more fascinating than the next 2 years in Buffalo.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. And it's tough. It was such a good game. Like talk about the games of the weekend. Like those were such fun games to watch. But yeah, man, I feel bad for Josh Allen because I feel like he did everything he could. And then people point to that 3rd and 9 kind of in their own zone right before the field goal as like a play that he could have done different. But I'm like, what about all like these other 50 plays where or not 50, but 30, 25 plays where he's just doing absolute magic. He's running over defensive tackles. He's, like I just felt like I was watching a kid in high school. The 65-yard bomb in the air that Diggs drops. And you're just like, insane. This is incredible. Like, this is incredible. So it's too bad that it didn't work out for him. Again, like I'm happy for Patrick Mahomes. I'm happy for Kansas City. I'm happy for good football. But I mean, I just thought that was such a heroic performance until you didn't get those plays where you got to have them at the end of the game, which I'm sure Buffalo fans are pissed about today. So.
To the NFC games now, Logan. 49ers beat the Packers 24-21. Big time hang on at the end. Big time drive by the San Francisco offense to close this thing out and pull ahead, ultimately finishing off with a Christian McCaffrey game-winning touchdown run. But then you have the 2 picks from Dre Greenlaw. Hey, bro, get down. So what did you see in this one that you find interesting as we look at it kind of through that Commanders offseason lens?
Yeah, first off, I was really impressed with Matt LaFleur and what they were able to do with those young playmakers, especially earlier in that game, just finding space, finding explosive opportunities. And Jordan Love, like we got a young quarterback that's going to have to develop here, probably. I mean, I'm anticipating them drafting a quarterback at 2, the Commanders, and just how they did it, like how, like if you can have him sit and have him develop kind of off in the wings, like think about where he was at this year and what he did this year, especially the second half of the year. Obviously, prior to this game, he had like 21 touchdowns, 1 pick or something like that over the last couple of games. So something insane, how good ridiculous. He's been. Yeah. And so like how did they make sure that he had a solid year, right? They leaned on the running game. They found easy opportunities, and then they made sure that the young receiving core developed around him, and he had good weapons. So I think that's an interesting roadmap. Same thing with Brock Purdy, for example, too. And again, this game is a little bit different than the Kansas City Chief, Buffalo Bill game, but I also look and I'm just like, the importance of the quarterback position in terms of elevating these offenses. Like I think I was expecting to see a ton of play action, which you did from Green Bay, right? A lot of play action, a lot of shots downfield. But like when you look at San Francisco in 3rd down situations, like they're in just straight drop back mode, and Brock Purdy's dealing, right? You get Brandon Ayuk making plays on 3rd and 5. Like the importance of having elite playmakers like the George Kittle breaking 2 tackles and running for 50 yards. Like it just shows you how having a quarterback, having playmakers, having people that elevate your play call is so incredibly critical. And that's what I think Jordan Love was doing for Green Bay, right? And then they didn't really have that outside of Aaron Jones. They didn't really have another piece that did that. But when you look at San Francisco, it's like, oh, we got George Kittle, we got Brandon Ayuk, we got Christian McCaffrey, and then we got a defense that's making plays for us. And I think that's the difference in the game. And when you're looking at roster construction, it's not, oh, we got a quarterback, we're fine. It's we got to have a great quarterback, and then how do we surround him with as many playmakers as we possibly can? How do we find a defense that creates plays and maximizes our whole team? Because I think that's something people sleep on with San Francisco is Kyle. He calls games trusting the defense that they can run the ball as many times as they need to, and I think that's something that sticks out when you watch this game. Is like it's a close game, but it's a close game because Kyle doesn't panic. Nobody panics. They just kind of stay the course. And the defense ends up making some plays for him. So
I think one thing that I've thought about with this game versus like the one we just talked about in the AFC, the Chiefs Bills game, is like who are the dudes, right? Like in the AFC game, the quarterbacks are the dudes, and the coaches call the game
dudes
generally that way, where it's like, yeah, like we're going to run it at times. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. But we know at the end of the day, like we can drop our guy back, and if he needs to deal, he'll deal. Right. Where San Francisco, it's not that way. Brock Purdy's job is to get the ball to the dudes. Like the quarterback is not the dude.
Right.
And so it's like, how do we get the ball to Christian McCaffrey? How do we get the ball to Ayuk? And how do we get them to, Debo when he doesn't have a maybe fractured shoulder, thank God, not fractured. Hopefully he can play this weekend. But like, how do you get the ball to Kittle? And how do you get them in the space where they can do their dude stuff? And to mix sports metaphors here, like Josh Harris was courtside last night as Joel Embiid scored 70.
That's crazy.
Yeah, 70 broke the Sixers franchise record. And like, in basketball, you have to have one of those top 7 guys if you even want to have a chance at winning a championship. That's just the way the sport is. But in football, it's not necessarily that. You don't have to have one of the top 5 quarterbacks to win in this league. It makes it so much easier. Like what the job that the Bills and the Chiefs have to do, because they have those guys, or the Ravens with Lamar, is so much simpler because your floor is so high. Those guys elevate everything so much. But when you look at Detroit, who's got a top 10 guy, but not a top half of the top 10 guy in Goff, when you look at Brock Purdy and what he does, you figure out, okay, what makes this guy good enough to be an NFL starter? Let's make sure that we play to those strengths and that those strengths are funneled through a way that gets the ball to our actual best guys. And we'll talk about this more with the Detroit game too, but like their target list is like Amon-Ra St. Brown, 14, Laporta, 11, like Gibbs has like 14 touches in the game. Like they intentionally, and this is why I like Ben Johnson so much, get the ball to the guys. Right. And Brock Purdy, I think, is so fantastic at understanding how and when to get the ball to the right guys. And while he did have some misses, his general management of the game, game manager, is so high level that he's kind of the perfect fit for that roster and that system.
Yeah, someone asked me like, "What's the biggest difference between San Fran this year and San Fran last year?" And you look at it, and it's the same schematically. It's the same playmakers. It's Brock Purdy just distributing. He's the point guard, right? And Kyle deserves a lot of credit. He finds ways to get those guys touches in space. But like, there's a play. I forget the exact sequence, but it's like George Kittle just makes a dude catch. He's covered, breaks a tackle, runs for 50, and I think it's on a 3rd and 6. And so the defense, the Green Bay, did a great job matching him. There wasn't a lot of space, but great throw by Brock Purdy, great play by your dude. And I think like that's something people sleep on is like, and we're going to talk about that in the Baltimore game or the Detroit game a little bit, but it's just like when you've got playmakers, how do you get them the ball? How do you maximize those touches? But also those guys got to make some plays for you to kind of deserve that dude moniker. And I think that's something that you saw in that game is like, they just got a lot of dudes, San Francisco, and they've got a lot of ways to beat you offensively. So
to use another basketball analogy, like Draymond Green is one of the greatest passers that we've ever seen. And he's going to go to the Hall of Fame because the guys that he's passing to were Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. And he just trusted that like, hey, I just got to get the ball to Steph Curry. What's he going to do? I don't know. He's Steph Curry. That's the point. Mm-hmm. Like my job is to get that guy a sliver of space and let him do the magic. And I think you see that with like Kittle, right? Like I'm just going to trust that he's going to win. And there's some trust throws and there's some anticipation. And there's, maybe this ball's not a great ball to throw because it's a super tight window and the catch is going to be contested to someone who's not George Kittle or Brandon Ayuk or whoever. but it is to them, and Brock trusts it. And the other thing too with
but
him,
I think that's like, sorry to cut you off, but I think that's the thing about Brock that makes him special is he's not afraid of those tight window throws in a way that, like, we did a lot of evaluation of Sam Howell the second half of the year, and I'm like, oh, this is a tight window throw. How can we expect him to make that? And I was like, let's go look at some other young quarterbacks, and I watched Brock Purdy. I'm like, Brock Purdy he's gonna make that throw, and I think that's the difference with him is like they had a quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo who I've got the utmost respect for. He's an awesome leader, great dude. People rally around him, right? But he was always a little bit tentative in those high leverage, big time throw, tight window situations. And you got a guy here in Brock Purdy who's like, I'm gonna let it rip. I'm gonna trust my guy. And there's so much value in terms of elevating the offense, specifically on third down, because defenses are just too damn good. You're not going to get a perfect picture. You're not going to get a guy wide open. As much as you can try to beat him with the pen, like, defenses are smart. They know what they're doing. And I think to see that, to kind of give Brock Purdy his credit and his flowers, I think that's the thing this year with that team that makes them scary to me, that makes me think they're going to play Baltimore here in a couple of weeks, and they can win if Brock Purdy plays like Brock Purdy can play. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah, for sure. And luck would be helpful. That first matchup's so unlucky in a lot of ways, balls off guys' hands, etc. But Baltimore then in the second half just crushed them. Anyway, the other thing I was going to say, Ted Nguyen, who does some film breakdown for The Athletic, had a great film clip on Twitter yesterday on the McCaffrey touchdown run.
Oh yeah.
Purdy flips the play.
Oh, does he?
And he flips the play one, so good job. Like, that's standard quarterback stuff of like understanding, okay, hey, my leverage is here. I got better numbers on right, left, for sure. So he does that, but he also, like, the tight end then is about to come in motion, and the play clock's running down. Like, it's literally at 3, and Juszczyk is like, hey, tight end needs to be over there, and tight end starts to go. Brock goes, no, stay there, and because he realizes and he understands the offense at such a high level that tight end doesn't matter to the run play. They've got what they need as is, and the delay of game is too risky. Tight end stays, resets, they get the play clock or the playoff as the clock hits 0. McCaffrey 37, 39, whatever it was, yard touchdown. But that high level understanding of the offense speaks well to Brock Purdy. It speaks well to the coaching staff that has taught everybody what they need to know. Like, it's just excellent high-level football.
And I think the other thing about that too is, like, great job. Like, I think this is the perfect illustration of what San Fran is great X's and O's, great execution, but ultimately you've got a dude at running back, and there's a free hitter in the hole, and Christian McCaffrey makes a miss. And Christian McCaffrey consistently makes the first guy miss. And that's why he's one of the best running backs in the league. And so I could call that play with Logan Paulson back there, and I'm going to run, and I'm going to get 6 yards. And I was like, wow, that was really cool. But the thing that makes it go from, oh, good job, Brock, to like amazing touchdown, game-changing play is you've got Christian McCaffrey back there. And I think about that trade all the time. When that trade happened and they gave up all that draft capital for him, I was like, that's so dumb. Like, that's so incredibly stupid. You shouldn't trade that much for a running back. But they have this tremendous vision and understanding of how to maximize that player, what he's going to do for the offense. They run the offense through him, and it looks like a fantastic trade, right? Because the GM, the head coach, have a cohesive vision of how to build around a player. So, like, one of the things is like, oh man, like so-and-so, player X is not being super productive. Young player, free agent player. Obviously, you weren't on the same page with how you're going to utilize that guy. And I think back to the Sean McVay thing with Puka Nacua. I'm sure everyone's seen that. Like, talk about understanding who a player is at a high level and how he fits your offensive vision. I hope, with every ounce of hope I have in my body, that's the kind of relationship the GM and the head coach have. Because if that's what you're doing, and you get a GM who can identify talent and get you that talent, the talent you want, you're going to do tremendous things. And I think that's the great thing about watching San Fran in the playoffs is they are that team. They've identified who they want to be, how they want to be there, and they just execute in terms of getting the roster where it needs to be at such a high level.
Yeah, and thank God their assistant GM, who played an enormous part of that, is now the GM here.
Right.
Which leads us to, well, actually, it doesn't really lead us to. That's just kind of a wrap on that game. And last but not least, Lions and Buccaneers. Big win, 31-23 for Detroit. Another 30-point game for this Detroit offense with one of the lead candidates, Ben Johnson, as head coach. And I think you just see what makes him good again, the way that he creates matchups. And, I mentioned this earlier, but to me, the most appealing thing about Ben Johnson is he believes in the dude theory. Like, it is so clear with how they run their offense that it's like, we need good dudes and we're going to get them the ball. We are going to emphasize Jahmyr Gibbs. We're going to emphasize Sam Laporta. We are going to, in a playoff game, get Amon-Ra St. Brown 14 targets. On a 3rd and 15, we're going to tell Amon-Ra St. Brown to run 16 yards, turn around, and be a bad you-know-what and catch the football. And that is exactly like how he thinks about the game, and they've gotten the personnel to do it, and they deploy it at an exceptionally high level.
Yeah, and talk about great talent identification, like with Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think that's he's a guy that can just do some. Every time I watch him, I come away being like, man, is this guy like a top 5 receiver in the NFL? Like, he just does so much good stuff, like subtly good stuff. His burst off the line of scrimmage. I'm watching all these receivers for the Senior Bowl, and I'm just like, that skill set is so awesome. The understanding stems, understanding routes, but understanding what his superpower is and how to maximize him from the slot. He can win outside, but can we get him good matchups? And then the Jahmyr Gibbs thing, I think, is so fascinating because it just shows you the importance of speed. Like, in the same way that Miami shows you the importance of speed, some of that stuff is literally like the concept is dead. They've run this beautiful play action concept. Tampa Bay's covered it perfectly. They check the ball down to the running back, who's like it's just a normal check down. There's nothing. I'm not trying to get him a touch, but then when I get him a touch, it's like, oh shoot, he might go for 25 on this. And I think that's
the touchdown that he has is he just breaks the math. That's an all-pro safety in pursuit with a pretty decent angle on most other running backs, and he just breaks the angle because he's so much faster than everybody else.
And I think that's, again, when you've got guys that elevate, because again, that's a great play call, but if David Montgomery's in there, that's probably not a touchdown. He probably breaks a tackle. It probably is a 15-yard gain and everyone, but that's where you get that elite playmaker. And I think we're probably preaching to the choir in terms of our fans, but you get that elite playmaker and a guy that can elevate. You've as a coach, you've put him in a good spot. You've coached him up. You've found an opportunity for him. And then, the God-given ability just takes over. So I think, and it's same thing on the other side. Like when you watch Mike Evans, I just am so impressed with that guy. His physicality, the consistency that he's brought, the trust that Baker Mayfield has in him. But you've got a guy that can win versus almost any coverage and consistently win. And I think finding guys like that and speaking to his skill set, you're not going to have him run the same route tree as Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? You're going to have him do different stuff, but understing who's the OC there? He did a great job. Yeah, I thought he did a great job of I
can't believe he's not on everybody's interview list.
Yeah, he's super impressive. Just in terms of, again, the kind of those game plan calls, here's a screen to the running back in the red zone, which we've gotten really good at. Here's another little easy touch where we maximize. So I was just really impressed with how he called the game. And obviously you get that unfortunate turnover by Baker in the 3rd quarter, I want to say. I don't remember exactly. Whenever that interception happens.
Yeah. Well, then you got the one at the end of the game as well, obviously. It's a heck of a play by Baker.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The linebacker Baker. But you're talking about the earlier one.
Yeah. So, but again, just maximizing playmakers, love Detroit, love what they're doing, love their vision. Sam Laporta, oh my gosh, that's the other thing, man. You've got 4 or 5 people that on 3rd down, you can be like, hey, we're going to have him run the isolation choice route. And he runs the isolation choice route on a linebacker, dices him up. Jahmyr Gibbs, same thing. Amon-Ra St. Brown. And just having the flexibility to be like, hey, you can be our guy this play. You can be our guy this sequence. You can elevate us so the defense can't key in. It was impressive. And again, if that defense was playing a little bit better, I'd feel like, man, maybe this team could do some damage, but I just don't think they've got the juice defensively to kind of make that push, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, definitely. Canellis, by the way, Carolina's going to interview him a second time. I would not be surprised if he winds up getting that job. I don't know.
Gosh, I'd probably turn that job down, honestly.
You would? You got a chance to go work with Bryce Young and your Canellis, you'd wait till next year?
I wait till next year. Next cycle. I think, when you talk to people around the league, it's the David Tepper thing, man. It looms so large over that organization. And it's just the fact he's quick to fire people. You're kind of, it's not an ideal situation. You need more support. Like, I don't want my first job to be my last job, I think is my point there. And I think because of how well he's done, he's going to have other opportunities. So like, be patient, get in the next coaching cycle. You're going to do a great job. Find a job that like fits you and what you want to be as a head coach, I think so.
Yeah, we'll see what happens down there in Tampa. But off they go, does Detroit to San Francisco. And then obviously you got Chiefs in Baltimore. That will be championship weekend. To the NFL draft we go. Logan, so you're out in California. Your agent has obviously got a bunch of players in this draft, and your guys out at Cal Strength. Did you train at Cal Strength back in the day? They've been doing that long?
No, Cal Strength wasn't a thing. I actually trained at Velocity Sports Performance, which is no longer a thing. But Cal Strength is like, this place is fantastic. Like, if you're a kid looking to get do combine prep, they have a beautiful kind of weight room facility. They have this relationship with this spa gym here where like we did hot yoga last night. They have a Pilates. It's just like,
how's the body feeling today after hot yoga?
I actually feel pretty good. Like it was like my shoulders are sore, like because you're holding your hands above your head so much. And I'm just not ready for that. But I was pleasantly surprised with myself to toot my own horn. But then they've got meals catered by like a 5-star restaurant out here. Like, I was just like, this is, if you want to get ready,
do combine prep.
Yeah, I want to be doing this. Like, they've got you stay in this beautiful hotel. Like, it's such a different thing than what when I was doing, where I was like driving 2 hours to go to Velocity Sports Performance when I was out there. But anyway, different deal. But
yeah, so you're out there working with some of the tight ends that your guys have.
Yeah, so obviously, like, there's different phases to the offseason program. Dave Spitz is the head coach out here in terms of getting them ready physically for combine. So he's doing 40 prep, doing 5-10-5, getting ready for the bench press. But a couple guys are going to the Senior Bowl, for example. Jared Wiley, the tight end from TCU, is kind of the biggest name of that group. And it's my job to kind of say, like, hey, here are some things from a blocking standpoint to think about. Here are some things from an angle standpoint, route running, more position-specific work. And then the other thing I do a lot of with them here is just like whiteboard stuff. And I think it's so surprising these guys have been in college there's a guy here, for example, who's been in college for 7 years. He's 25 years old, and he's an offensive lineman from Wake Forest, actually from the DC area. But, like just how they've been taught football over that span, because college offenses are so different. So kind of laying a foundation for them from like, hey, these are the types of questions you're going to get in the interview process. These are some things you should probably know as foundational, like NFL things you should see, and just kind of increase their football knowledge, and then just help them kind of give the best interview they possibly can. So like last night we're on the whiteboard, we do a little bit of field work first, then we're on the whiteboard, and it's really just about kind of that mental process. And then I was not the best physical athlete of all time. I'm not Julio Jones, and I'm well aware of that. My career is what it is. I'm very proud of it, but I also talk a lot about professionalism and just how to kind of make sure you're around longer than the other guy in the room with you, and so that's something else I talk about. And it's really just kind of getting them all prepped for kind of the biggest job interview of their life. So
yeah, for sure. That's very cool, and excited to maybe talk a little bit more later in the week or next week about how it all went on the back end of it. But you are getting a chance to work with some of the top tight ends, top folks that are going to the Senior Bowl, and you've been grinding the tape. And this is a good time, or as good of a time as any, to announce that on Thursday's pod, Jim Nagy, the senior director of the Senior Bowl, will be with us. So we're very excited about that. Jim is the man. He's the one who organizes everything. He knows all the prospects. He knows so many front office personnel, coaches. Like, we'll be able to ask him not only about what he's doing down there in Mobile, but about Adam Peters and about some of the coaches that he is familiar with that the Commanders are looking at. So we'll be able to talk about everything with Jim on Thursday. So excited for that. But as you start to do your prep, because you will also be in Mobile next week for the Senior Bowl, like, who are some of the guys that have started to stand out to you when you talk about not just that second pick and, like, obviously the top quarterbacks aren't going to be there, but the next tier of guys is. So whether anybody sticks out there that may be a trade down situation, or you get into that second, third round, like top of those rounds, which are going to be really valuable contributors for the Commanders, hopefully immediately, but certainly moving forward as they get into this rebuild.
Yeah, and I think that's the fun thing about the Senior Bowl specifically is like it's 100 and I think it's 135 guys right now on the rosters that have committed, and it's like some crazy number like 85% of those guys will get drafted.
Yeah.
So it's just that Jim Nagy does such a good job of identifying talent, getting those guys in here and saying this is the draft pool. So I think between that bowl game and then what's the other bowl game? East West, the Shrine game.
The Shrine game, yeah.
That composite like that 200 of those guys will get drafted. So they just do such a good job of identifying that talent. And I think the thing that really sticks out to me this year about the draft in general is like, obviously I think Washington will probably go quarterback at number 2. And I'm kind of leading Daniels at this point at 2. Like, just like when you watch this film, it's tremendous. It's fantastic. But then it's about how do you find playmakers that fit him? And in this draft specifically, like the 2 positions that are just incredibly dense are offensive line, specifically offensive tackle, and wide receiver. So when you look at the list for receivers here, you're like, man, this guy who's like the 15th wide receiver probably would have been taken ahead of of Quentin Johnson last year. Like, that's how good he is. And so having that kind of depth and all of those guys here at the Senior Bowl is going to be so much fun, I think. And that's the thing about it is like, it's like you turn on the film, you're like, man, this guy NFL player, this guy's NFL player, right? Like, here, let me just pull my notes up real quick while we're talking, because I got a lot of notes, Coach, and I can go through those players for you real quick. But it's just like about having those opportunities. And then I think the other thing that I mentioned, the offensive line, like there are going to be some really impressive offensive linemen there that, like, so with that first pick in the second round, the one from Pittsburgh, and then the one from the Commanders pick, it's just like there's such a good opportunity.
I mean, the pick from Chicago.
Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah. And so I think that's something that just sticks out to me. So like Xavier Legette is a guy that right now, like he's a guy that had the highest miles per hour last year in college football. He's an explosive play weapon, and he's going to be around probably in that kind of late first, early second round. Devontae Walker from North Carolina is this kind of explosive playmaker, down the field type guy, right? You got Johnny Wilson from Florida State. You've got you got Malachi Corley from Western Michigan, who's like Debo Samuel's twin, like no kidding. And so like these opportunities for these receivers, like some of those guys, like Xavier Legette to me, he's a first round guy that might slip because of the volume of first round players into the second round. And I think you sprint the card in because he's a former special teams guy. He's super physical. He's a big play weapon. He reminds me from a physicality standpoint of like an AJ Brown, Julio Jones, like just a freaky, big physical dude. And I think like the fact that guy is going to be there in the second round potentially is just something that you're like, this is fantastic for the Commanders because we can say, hey, here's our quarterback of the future. Here's a dynamic, legitimate. And it's not like, oh, we're just taking a receiver because there's a receiver here. We're taking a legitimate playmaker that would have been the best receiver in last year's draft, probably.
Yeah. One thing that Nagy was tweeting about over the weekend that I think is interesting too, and that is great for the Commanders, is this draft does thin out. Like the rounds 4 through 7 is not very good in his estimation. That you're going to be taking guys in round 5 that are on your undrafted board, which sucks. But also, the Commanders have 5 picks in the top 100. Yep. And because you pick so early in the round, like you have a chance to maybe get an extra draftable player where other teams later in the 4th round, later in the 5th round are going to be, obviously taking guys that they would prefer to just sign as undrafted free agents because the talent pool is not there. It also just depends on your position's need or your positional needs, though. And basically the reason, according to Nagy and his theory of the case, is that like some of the COVID years and all this stuff is finally caught up. That guys like they kind of ran out of depth with all these COVID year guys finally having to be in the draft or finally kind of wearing out these last 3 years of guys taking extra years, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. And so you have a lot less juniors in this draft, and you have and the NIL stuff too, right? Guys are more willing to stay because they can make money in college, and so ultimately, the result is a thinner draft, but the higher you are, the less chance that impacts you because your pick might be before the talent runs out. And with that stacked early, 5 picks in the top 100, that is exceptional for Washington to try to get this talent-rich top before the bottom falls out of the draft.
I totally agree, and I think it's good. It's rich at mentioned offensive line, very rich there, very rich at receiver. But then you look at like edge, which the past couple of years has been very dynamic. With kind of Aiden Hutchinson's these kind of really top end premier guys, and there's not really guys like that this year. So I think for the Commanders in terms of team building the next couple of weeks, like there are some good players. Like Latu will be there. He's the guy from UCLA who's the Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. Really dynamic edge rusher with great hands, but like after that, it gets a little bit of thin. And there are guys where you're like, oh, this guy has something, but kind of to your point, Craig, about the depth. It's like at that position specifically, it's like these are like the 4 or 5 guys where like these guys will come in right away and help us. And then there's some other developmental athletes that could be features, but again, you're talking a little bit more developmental there. So to your point, like if you want a receiver, like have at it. There's like a million of them. Offensive linemen, it's deeper than it was last year, in my opinion, in terms of starting caliber players. But like linebacker, tight end, defensive line, you're a little bit like